We are in The Road to Paris, Chapter 13, Fun and Games. "Let's go, Paris," Mrs. Lincoln called from downstairs. "It's time. And remember, you have an appointment this afternoon with Dr. Stern. It's right after school, so don't dally. We don't want to keep the doctor waiting." "That's easy for you to say," thought Paris, retying her shoes for the fourth time that morning. "You don't have to talk to him." Dr. Stern was a psychologist, and Paris was in no hurry to go and see him. Who was it decided she needed to visit a psychologist anyway? No one had asked her, and yet an appointment had been made. Paris sighed and dragged herself downstairs. "It's a routine visit," said Mrs. Lincoln to soothe her. "Every foster child who's ever lived here has been to see the psychologist." That didn't make Paris feel any better. She was forced to see a psychologist at the last foster home. Malcolm, too. That first time, he'd prepared her. "Some of these guys are okay," he said. "They help you figure out your feelings and stuff. But then again, some of them just want to poke around in your brain, see if they can find anything to give a name to." "What for?" she asked. But Malcolm couldn't help her there. He shrugged and told her not to worry. She hadn't. Even so, she hadn't much liked the stupid questions they asked. "Do you miss your mom? And how do you feel about her drinking? And how do you feel about your dad leaving you? And do you blame your mom for putting you in a foster home?" Paris figured these were questions the shrink could answer himself, so why waste time asking her? Mrs. Lincoln had set the appointment for 3:30 p.m. so that Paris wouldn't have to lose time from school. For Paris, that meant a day of watching the clock instead of the blackboard. Ashley asked more than once if Paris was feeling okay. "I'm fine," Paris said each time, flashing a phony grin. When the final bell rang at the end of the day, Paris gathered her books and bolted from the classroom. Mrs. Lincoln's car was already parked out front, and Paris climbed in without saying a word. The drive to the doctor's office seemed too short. Before Paris knew it, Mrs. Lincoln was getting her settled in the waiting room. "I'll be back for you later," said Mrs. Lincoln, leaving her in the care of the doctor's assistant. When her name was finally called, Paris said, "Here," as if she were in school. The doctor's assistant steered her in the direction of Dr. Stern's private office. Stern was leafing through a folder, shaking his head, conferring with a colleague who was sitting on the corner of his desk. "Jeez, did you see this kid's file? Alcoholic mother, victim of child abuse, suffered abandonment, and God, there's no telling what dark thoughts are rolling around in that little head. I better make sure those foster parents know what they've gotten themselves into. Oh, hello there." Paris stood inside the door. Dr. Stern slipped a folder onto his desk and motioned his colleague out of the office. "Come on in. Paris, isn't it? I'm ready for you now." "And I'm ready for you too," thought Paris, "since you think you know so much." "My name is Dr. Stern." Paris said nothing. "This is your first time here, right? So I want you to relax. Most of my patients manage to leave with all their fingers and toes." Dr. Stern smiled at his own joke. Paris did not. "I see from your records that you've been to see a psychologist before." Paris said nothing. "So how are things going for you at the Lincolns?" "Fine," said Paris. "Are you getting along with the other children in the home?" "Yes." "Any problem you want to discuss while you're here?" "Like what?" asked Paris. "So, are there any problems?" "Like what? Is anybody hurting you in any way?" Paris hesitated for a moment, studying the tweed carpet. "There's Jordan," she said at last. "Yes, Jordan? What does Jordan do?" Dr. Stern leaned in close, pen poised over his pad, ready to note anything important. "He kicks me under the table," said Paris in her most sincere voice. "I see. said the doctor, leaning back in his chair. Well, that's normal for little boys, he said, sounding disappointed. Anything else? Paris shook her head. She knew if she opened her mouth, she'd laugh out loud. So basically, everything's fine at that home, said Dr. Stern. Let's move on then. Today, we're going to play a few games that will tell me something about you. Would that be all right? Paris nodded. She was looking forward to having a little fun. The afternoon flew by in a whirl of tests disguised as games. Paris liked the ink blots best. As the young doctor flashed each card, Paris was to identify what she saw. When he showed her an ink blot that clearly resembled a butterfly, Paris said elephant. When she saw a dragonfly, she said school bus. Let him figure that one out, thought Paris. Next came a game of free association. That was even more fun. When the doctor said black, Paris said ice cream. When he said mother, she said sneaker. He scribbled notes furiously throughout, and Paris bit her lip to keep from laughing. In the end, Stern placed an anxious call to Mrs. Lincoln, asking that she come in right away to take Paris home. Mrs. Lincoln, said Dr. Stern when she arrived, please give me a call tomorrow so we can discuss a few things. Mrs. Lincoln agreed, giving Paris's shoulder a squeeze. That evening, when Mrs. Lincoln came to say good night to Paris, she lingered in the doorway. I bet I know why Dr. Stern wants to talk to me, said Mrs. Lincoln. You were pulling that doctor's leg today, weren't you? Paris tensed up, wondering if she were in trouble. Yes, she whispered. Mrs. Lincoln shook her head and laughed. Exactly like Erletta, she said, more to herself than to Paris. You'll do just fine, sugar, she said. You'll do just fine. Paris relaxed her shoulders, her heart beginning to thaw. Thanks, Mom. Paris's new mom switched off the light, the music of her laughter still hanging in the air. Well, that's the end of chapter 13. Paris was having a little fun with the doctor and seemed to have bonded with Mrs. Lincoln because she called her mom, and that's the first time we've heard her call her that in our story. So let's see how the bonding goes as we continue in the road to Paris, and join me in chapter 14. We are reading The Road to Paris, and in chapter 13, we saw that Paris was getting more and more comfortable with Mrs. Lincoln because she called her mom. So let's find out what happens in chapter 14, Thanksgiving. Early on Thanksgiving morning, Paris went downstairs for breakfast and was surprised to find everyone else already up and busy as ants on a hill of sugar. The sink held a mountain of yams. Erletta was chopping celery and onions. David was manning the toaster, putting in one slice of bread after another, then handing the toast to Jordan, who ripped them into smaller bite-sized pieces and piled them in a bowl for stuffing. Mrs. Lincoln sat at a table snapping string beans, and Mr. Lincoln rubbed spices on the fat turkey. Happy Thanksgiving, Mrs. Lincoln said to Paris as she walked in. Can I help? Asked Paris, not really wanting to. This many people in one space made her feel as if the walls were closing in. No, not this time, said Mrs. Lincoln. Why don't you check on Jet's food dish and make sure he has some fresh water? Paris nodded and grabbed an apple from the fruit bowl on her way out. The challenge for the day was not to get in anybody's way. Paris managed it by playing with and feeding Jet, taking care of David's pet rabbit, and feeding and reading a chapter book. She even raked up leaves in the yard without being asked. At about noon, people started showing up at the door. Paris was introduced to each family member by Mr. Lincoln. Grandma Lincoln came first. Then Mrs. Lincoln's sister Ida and her 2 girls. Mr. Lincoln's baby brother Raymond, who was single, came next. Finally, Mrs. Lincoln's sister Jolene arrived with her 9-year-old son, Sheldon. "We call her the mouth," Mr. Lincoln whispered to Paris. The dining room table was packed. Mrs. Lincoln had used every extra leaf to make it long enough to seat everyone. Packed or not, if anyone asked Paris, she would tell them that one person was missing from that table, and that person was Malcolm. Mr. Lincoln said grace, then served up a turkey, while Mrs. Lincoln started sending the rest of the dishes around the table. Sheldon, seated opposite Paris, stuck his tongue out at her as soon as he could catch her eye. "Quit it, Sheldon," snapped David. He leaned over to Paris and said, "Feel free not to like him. We don't like him much either." He said it loud enough for Sheldon to hear. Paris was pretty sure Mrs. Lincoln heard it too, yet for some reason she let it pass without comment. Paris concentrated on loading her plate up with candied yams, a few string beans for color, corn pudding stuffing, cranberry sauce, and turkey. She took a swallow of eggnog before digging in. "So," said Sheldon's mother, Jolene, "this is a new one, huh? My God, sis, you collect sick kids like strays." Paris choked on her eggnog. Mrs. Lincoln banged on the table with her fist. "They are not sick, and they are not strays," she said, between tight lips. Arletta patted Paris on the back until she stopped coughing. "Don't mind Aunt Jolene," whispered Arletta. "She can't help herself. She was raised by wolves. That's why she knows so much about stray dogs." Paris managed to smile at that. She spent the rest of the afternoon avoiding Jolene and Sheldon, though. Those 2 were poisonous. It was hard for Paris to believe they were part of the Lincoln clan at all. After the main meal, the kids raced to the park at the foot of the hill and arranged a game of softball. Uncle Raymond joined them, and for once so did Arletta. David knocked at several neighbors' doors and picked up a few more kids along the way. When they set up teams, Sheldon decided to sit out of the game. He said softball was a stupid game, but David told her the real reason was that Sheldon couldn't play for spit, and he was the world's sorest loser. Paris was happy to be included. She had an okay time, too, even though she never got a home run. She couldn't quite shake off Jolene's comment, and Sheldon didn't help. Every time he caught her looking at him, he'd say, "What you looking at, Foster?" He wouldn't call her by her name, just Foster, short for foster child. Not once did he or his mother let her forget that she was an outsider, that she didn't belong, that this new home of hers was borrowed. Back at the house, Paris stuffed her feelings with fresh baked pumpkin pie and ice cream, having seconds and even thirds. Now she was too stuffed to sleep. She lay awake for a long time, hearing Sheldon's taunting voice in her head, calling her Foster. It was enough to give her a bellyache. And it did. And again, we see some good and bad happening to Paris on Thanksgiving. While she was having a great time with mostly everybody, there was a few troublemakers. But Paris is holding her head high, and we're going to see what happens next to Paris in chapter 15. So come back with me to chapter 15.